Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to our broadcast of War of the Worlds. I have a really special treat for you. We have someone who knows a lot about Orson Welles and War of the Worlds, and he's going to chat with us a little bit about both. So let me just take a moment to introduce our special guest. His name is Frank Beacham. And Frank is a New York City-based independent writer, director, and producer who works in print, radio, television, film, and theater. So he has done it all. For his writing, he's been a former staff reporter for the United Press International, the Miami Herald, Gannett Newspapers, and Post Newsweek. Beacham's articles and stories have appeared in dozens of magazines and newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and Village Voice. He has so many other credits, but beyond in that long list of credits, Frank wrote the play Maverick, which was written with George DeMoss, which was the story of his work with Orson Welles. It was produced off-Broadway at the Connolly Theater in 2019. Beacham also produced, with the late Richard Wilson, the 6-hour retrospective Theater of the Imagination radio stories by Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater, and wrote and directed and produced the documentary The Mercury Company Remembers with Leonard Maltin. He's done so many other things, but we're going to get right to the interview. So welcome aboard. Please come on, Frank.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here and to talk about this. It's a really wonderful thing that you're doing this production again. It's really a lot of fun, and it's an interesting story.
Well, we are so honored to have done it this year, and just so pleased that you got in touch with us and that we are going to have a chance to chat a little bit more about Orson and War of the Worlds.
Great. So shoot, what would you like to know?
Well, I think I'd love to start by hearing a little bit more about Orson and the medium of radio. We know certainly about his film work, but I gather maybe a lot of people might not know about his love of the radio medium.
Well, when I first met him, I think we really clicked over our background in radio, because I had started in radio, and Orson loved radio. In fact, he told me of all the mediums he worked in, radio was his favorite. And so it was clear that he loved it. He always said, because nobody really made any big money in radio, they left it alone. But the thing he really liked about the medium, as he did it back in the early days of radio drama, was he saw it as a theater of the imagination. And that's what he called it. He said that it was like being in a town square and telling a story. It went back to the very origins of entertainment. And that was the bottom line to him. He liked being able to tell that story in the medium he worked in. Now, what he did was he treated radio like a symphony orchestra. And he told me this. It was exactly how he saw it. He combined, it was an ensemble. He had actors, he had the orchestra, which was Bernard Herrmann, which is no slouch, and he had incredible sound effects. And he would stand on a podium and he would direct. And he would use a wand, and he would just move around. And I mean, he got into it in a big way, but he saw sound in the same way that theater uses lighting. It was an important element, and music and all were intertwined to the point they came out as one. Now, there were some funny things that happened. They did shows in the 1930s at Lieberkranz Hall. And that's an old building. It's no longer there, but it was at 11 East 58th Street. And Orson was so intent on broadcast put a rifleman on a roof and fired into the Manhattan sky on a live radio show, if you can believe that. And another thing he did, the thing had these really acoustic chamber restrooms that were, that sounded like the sewers of Paris when you had an open mic in them. So one day he was doing the sewers of Paris, and he had an open mic in a bathroom. What he didn't think was that somebody would actually use it. So on the live broadcast, there's a flush of the toilet, and Orson's eyes get real big because he's hearing this in his headset. But I mean, this was live radio, and there were some really wild things that happened. And these guys that worked on the show would just go one after another. And it was really wonderful to hear how they did things. Houseman, John Houseman told me, he was the producer, that one day they had to figure the right sound effect for severing a human head. And they brought all these fruits and vegetables in, and they had a thing to slam on them to cut them. And they finally determined that a cabbage sounded most like a human head on the sound effect. And so it was really wonderful. And Cliff Thorsness, who was the sound man, kept all of the gear that he used for those shows. And I got to work with him later on, and it was just remarkable, the things that he had figured out how they would sound on the air as opposed to what they were. And it was really great. It was a terrific experience. And seeing what you could do with radio, I still think, and we're seeing it now with podcasts, but we now have three-dimensional sound and some of these things, which are just remarkable technologies that have not really been used the full extent of what could be. And when I heard that you guys were doing the radio, I thought, what a great idea for the pandemic, because you can't be on a stage. And I'm not sure it won't lead to something else. So I think it's great you're doing it.
Well, Frank, you said something right at the very top that really hit me about theater of the imagination. Because as we were trying to figure out what to do this year where we couldn't gather in person, I kept on thinking radio feels to me to be theater adjacent, because you need to use your imagination in the theater in a way that you don't with TV and film. And it seemed to sort of make sense to me. And I just love that Orson called it that. That really is just great to know.
It was fundamental to the way he saw it. He felt that that your imagination is freer with radio imagery, and in a film or in television, it's laid out for you.
Yep.
In radio, you have to imagine it, and his whole idea was driving the human imagination. That's what he was doing. It was really wonderful.
So can we turn to War of the Worlds a little bit? Because you certainly know a lot about that broadcast. And I'm curious, any stories you heard or things you know about the original broadcast that we'd love to hear.
Yes. The broadcast started out as a real dud. Howard Koch wrote the script. He complained he didn't really think it was any good. Orson was very busy. He was directing Danton's Death at the time. He allowed it to get to the point where they would go in and do a rehearsal. And there is a rehearsal tape that is lost. We never were able to find it, but Dick Wilson remembered it. And in it, Orson whispers into the microphone, to John Houseman, who's in the booth, John, this is the biggest piece of crap the Mercury's ever done. You have to figure out what to do to save it. And what happened is they take a break, and Orson comes up with this brilliant idea. Now, the show started slow, but what Orson figured is that if they created long pauses, that would create dramatic tension. And with that dramatic tension, it would throw the listener into another realm because they're so used to hearing tight air on radio.
Mm-hmm.
So he would do these long pauses. And he also, at a bar, they had a rule about not imitating people. In this case, Orson wanted them to because he needed to save the show, and encouraged them to do it. And they ran free. Now I've got a clip.
Oh, great!
And I'm going to play. There's 3 or 4 of them, but this is Dick Wilson, and this was in Grover's Mill on the 50th anniversary, and he starts with War of the Worlds, and then we'll go to John Houseman, and then we'll go to the chaos in the studio because none of the guys knew what was coming down until they got out of there. So it was really, really remarkable. So I'm going to play this first clip of Dick Wilson.
Did you have any idea, Dick, when that show went on the air, that it would produce even an inkling of what it wound up producing? Panic and people running around, just crazy. They really believed the program?
No, nobody thought that it would be good. Nobody had expectations for this show. We thought it was one of the weaker shows of the series. And for a long time, there was a rehearsal recording while the actors are going through their paces or a musical cue or something, in which Orson is whispering in his own microphone to Jack Houseman in the control room, saying, Jack, this is the worst program we have ever done. Now, think of something. We've got to make this so that people believe it. Now, think hard. Think hard. This is terrible. This is absolutely terrible. I think that Jack knew by the middle break that something was amiss, and I, who was focused really in the theater at that time, although I was paid out of the radio budget, knew something was wrong when I walked out into this empty lobby, and the receptionist had both phones up to her ears and saying, "I'm sorry, madam, it's only a broadcast. It's only a broadcast, sir." and 2 befuddled policemen got off the elevator answering some sort of query about a panic or something. And of course, they were very, very bemused and puzzled to see the quietness of it. And they went in, looked at the studio, looked inside, saw these actors acting up a storm and the musicians playing around. They walked in, sidled around the studio, finally ended up in the control room, folded their arms over their chest, and watched the rest of the show.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it is. It's a remarkable story because none of these people had a clue that they were causing this gigantic event. They were worried that they were doing a bad show. And I talked to Howard Koch about it, and Howard Koch, he said it was awful. He thought he was handed a dud. And I don't know if you know this, but near Grover's Mill was where the Hindenburg had crashed a year earlier. And Howard Koch took those tapes, those audio things of the Hindenburg, and used that as a kind of a theme for this. So if you listen to the earlier Hindenburg broadcast and then you listen to this, you'll see there's a similarity because it's a year later. So, so let's continue with this because I think this will give a kind of a full view. Now we're going to John Houseman, who's going to talk about this. So,
Great.
Itself was one of those miracles. It just happens to be a very, very good script. And everybody pitched in. I mean, the actors, the famous story of the man who was playing the reporter who went downstairs and played the Hindenburg record over and over and over, and then virtually reproduced it in a different context.
Strikes him head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods of fires. The gas mag, cracks in the automobiles, spreading everywhere. Coming this way.
the man who was to read the Secretary of the Interior. He really pulled a very fast one on us because he could imitate Roosevelt's voice perfectly. And I don't know to what degree Orson or I or anybody was aware that he was going to use that voice.
Orson was very aware.
Of course, it was one of the most damning and effective things in the show.
Citizens of the nation, I shall not try to conceal the gravity of the situation that confronts the country, nor the concern of your government in protecting the lives and property of its people. However, I wish to impress upon you, private citizens and public officials, all of you, the urgent need of calm and resourceful action.
But the whole atmosphere in that studio was absolutely electric. I mean, everybody suddenly realized there was a chance to do a wonderful show, and the verisimilitude of it, of course, was very important, and that was our main preoccupation. And then Orson himself made an enormous contribution because the beginning of that show, you've heard it many times, I'm sure, it's very boring. It's supposed to be. That was the whole trick. But Orson emphasized that, and Orson carried that a step much further than we would have had the nerve to do, anybody, Stewart or anybody else. So in the beginning, you have these terribly slow scenes and these long pauses and then these Chopin piano solos. And the fact is that by about 13 minutes into the show, something had to happen because the show was so boring that it was not possible that the show would be. And then very slowly, it started to accelerate. Which explains why people believed it. Because the fact is that if you accelerate as cleverly as that, as well as that, people don't notice that suddenly you're covering the incidents that would take a day, you're covering it in 5 minutes. And that's one of the magic things about radio, that you can create that illusion and that suspension of disbelief. And Orson was largely contributing to that.
A couple of things. How it was in this case was describing the show in terms that were more favorable than they thought at the time. It was just, he was not going to admit how bad it was. Now, Orson pulled it out of the hat. This thing about how it had to accelerate, that didn't come until after the rehearsal, and they're in a bar. And the genius of this is that Orson figured out how to do this on the fly. And he was standing in front of the actors, slowing them down just on instinct. And that's what's so brilliant about his work, is that he just senses the stuff, and he was able to pull it out of the hat and make it so realistic. But none of the actors, he had told them, yeah, do your best impression. This is not something they normally did, but he was looking for anything, and he got it. And this guy doing Roosevelt was, he had done impressions of Roosevelt, and he thought it was a really great thing to do. And it turned out to be one of the most famous bits of the show. It's really remarkable.
Wow. It just goes to show the ingenuity of trusting your instinct.
Yes, absolutely. And Orson had an uncanny instinct. If he had planned this, it'd be one thing, but it was done spontaneously. And as he did a lot of things. So the next clip is Chaos in the Studio. And this is quite funny. This is Dick Wilson again.
Someone called the liaison producer and said, you've got to interrupt and say, this is only a broadcast.
But you did that periodically, did you not?
No, he did it periodically. And Jack Houseman said to this poor white-faced fellow, why don't we wait till the break? It's coming up in just a couple minutes. And he says, no. I says, I've got to do it right away. And Jack literally, I'm talking to Jack, John Houseman, literally imposed himself back to the door, blocking the door for this fellow, you know.
This is in the middle of a live broadcast.
This is in the middle of a live broadcast, saying, now just wait. The break is coming up. in just a moment. And the guy is sweating and he's ashen-faced by this time. And so I think Jack knew. Orson never knew until the reporters arrived. And Mr. Paley came down.
Mr. Paley?
Yes, Mr.
William Paley, the guy who ran
that's
through the
right.
desk?
He came down in his bathrobe and his slippers and said, "What's going on? What is all this?" Telephones are jangling and so forth.
That's incredible. William
Incredible.
Paley down in his bathrobe to see what's happening.
That's amazing. Those are amazing clips, Frank.
Yeah, we were able to do Houseman. We did, Leonard Maltin and I did these clips, most of them. And then others are from Dick in the studio. And we had a great time doing these radio things because I learned so much from him working with him on these tapes. And also, Orson, if there was one thing Orson liked to talk about, it was radio. He was a guy that did not want to go down memory lane. And he didn't like talking about film because he felt that everything had been taken away from him. But with radio, he felt that that was some of the most creative work he did. And the other kind of joke is that the only real discipline Orson had in radio was the clock. Because when the clock struck a certain time, he had to start. In theater, he would rehearse forever and they would delay the openings. In film, it would take him forever. Radio had to be ready to go at a certain time. And he did. Oh, one very funny thing, he traveled around New York City in an ambulance to get to radio studios. And he had investigated whether this was legal. And he found there was no law against hiring an ambulance. And he'd lay down on the cot, have John Houseman read him his lines, and he'd go to the next studio. And he was doing all this radio during that same period. But there were different studios throughout the city. And that's how he would get around in an ambulance.
That's amazing. That is amazing.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no. I kind of just have a question for you about the Mercury Theater.
Yeah.
And we're a theater company and we're sort of transitioning to audio this year. I'm kind of curious if you know anything about Mercury Theater's sort of transition to the radio and either how that happened or how they felt about it or anything you might have to offer.
Well, they felt very strongly about it because it was their main source of income. Now, at first, they were not sponsored, but Orson liked the medium and he liked doing both. And his voice made him a very famous radio guy. And he got paid a lot. I mean, he did the shadow, though he couldn't do the laugh. He did the shadow and he got paid a lot for that. That would finance the theater. So, but when War of the Worlds ended, it took off because this is when, as John Houseman said, Campbell's Chicken Soup then became a sponsor. And he said they figured that if Orson could sell A Martian Invasion, he could sure as hell sell Campbell's Chicken Soup. And that's the thinking that went behind that, and that put them on the map. From that point on, after War of the Worlds, the Mercury Theater was profitable. So I think you kind of, in his case, he needed this. And he did stay out of jail, though in the next clip, we'll hear that he was worried they were going to arrest him. So,
awesome.
So here's and this is the last one. This is Arlene Francis, and you may remember her. She was on What's My Line, and she was really one of the early pioneers of television. However, at this stage, she was in a theater production that Orson was doing called Danton's Death. And they were rehearsing, and they were waiting on Orson to come from the theater. And what we're going to hear now is we'll hear her and some of the others in talking about what happens after the show.
We used to rehearse at the theater
Wait a
We
minute.
used to rehearse at the theater until midnight or later, and Orson came from that broadcast, and he burst into the. We were all waiting for him, and he burst into the auditorium and said, "I don't know what's going to happen. The police are going to be after me. I know all hell has broken loose now because of the fact that I had this War of the Worlds done so well that they really thought it was going on." And he came in. He couldn't believe the reaction to it. None of us could, But we all stayed there a long time, and he was talking about it, and he was. He said, "It's nothing. They made such a big thing out of nothing. How could they do that? How are people so silly as to believe a thing like that? But in the first place, they hear my voice. They don't think I'm going to be the one to announce a war between the worlds."
We were opposite Charlie McCarthy, not the senator, but the wooden doll. That was the other network. And Roosevelt sent a telegram the next day saying this only goes to prove that all intelligent people are listening to Charlie McCarthy.
I was in the control room and sitting next to the CBS, our supervisor, who was Davidson Taylor, quite a well-known figure, later ran Columbia Performing Arts. And he got a call and suddenly got up and left rather precipitately. And then he came back about 3 minutes later, white as a sheet. I said, "We got to stop the show. We got to stop." We ran over our first half. Instead of breaking at 27, 28 minutes, we ran about 35. And I remember that Dave said, "John, you got to stop the show. You got to stop it." And I interposed my body between him and Orson and said, "No, never, never. You can't ruin the show." So he wasn't a terribly strong character, and he was not a brutal character. So he stood there helplessly, and for about another 5 minutes, we went on until we finished the show. Then as soon as we finished the show, I or David or somebody went up to Orson and said, "Look, you got to make an explanation because this hell was broken loose, right? And I can't tell you what, but just make an explanation." So he made his set speech, which was all about Halloween. Oh, that was our little Halloween joke, and so and so. But by then, I'd had calls in the control room from governors of states and not them into the show, saying, "What is this? If this is a joke, we're coming down and we're going to punch you in the nose." I mean, this was some governor of Iowa or somewhere. And then the second half of the show went on. Well, by then, the second half of the show is totally uncontroversial. It's pure H.G. Wells, and it's the two last survivors on the earth after by accident they've survived. But by then, of course, everybody was rushing around. Nobody was listening. And then when it was over, CBS sent dozens of house police into the studio. They snatched all the scripts, and they hustled Orson and me into some room, some back room, and they kept us there for about half an hour. Then the press was released to us, and they behaved dreadfully. But the press was very sore at radio. Radio had displaced them as the prime news medium, and they were very sore. So they made the most of it. They would do things like, well, you've heard about the family of 5 that was killed on the New Jersey highway. Have you heard any more around the country? And they would all pull things like that, so that we believed for the next 2 or 3 hours that we were mass murderers.
So that's amazing.
Amazing.
Made them think they were mass murderers.
Wow. That just goes to show the power of live radio, and they couldn't control them. That's great.
It reminds you a bit of today. I mean, the kind of insanity of it all. But it's remarkable. I mean, it launched Orson's career, and he went on to make Citizen Kane. So I guess in retrospect, it was also a lesson in not reading too much into the power of media. But back then, people really believed everything they heard, and that's really remarkable.
Frank, before we go, I would love to hear a little bit about how you met Orson. You kind of have some great stories about that.
I did. I had a video company, and we bought one of the first beta cams. And a beta cam, by today's standards, is a gigantic, huge thing, but it made one magnificent leap, and that was it was a tape recorder and a camera in one piece. And that had never been done before. And before that, it was a lot of complex, cluttered equipment. And we were doing Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. I'm ashamed to say it. I didn't know any better, but it was a job, and it got me to LA. And we had a freelance editor there that was working with Orson. And he told Orson about this Betacam. And Orson was absolutely blown away. He says, it's an Airflex without film. And he said, I want to meet this guy. So he calls me up, and we have lunch. And we eat lunch at Mama's and we bonded over radio because, you know, I was trying to make conversation with him. And it turned out that was what made it click. He loved it, and I loved it, and we talked more about radio then than video. However, this led to a lot of other lunches, and Orson using me to raise money for him to do a show called Orson Welles Solo, which used a series of Betacams. And Orson, to make a long story short, Orson, I raised the money at the very last minute. Orson was working on the script the night before we were to start shooting, and he died at the typewriter.
Oh boy.
And it was a terrible situation, and I kind of didn't know what to do. But because of what happened, I got embraced by the Welles community, and a lot of the actors, it was just about everybody I got to know. And we did these projects, and I did a series of them, culminating with The Cradle Will Rock that I did with Tim Robbins, which, based on an Orson story that he had told me at lunch one day. So it turned out to be quite an adventure, even after Orson had died. But I didn't realize at the time how much I would learn from him. I mean, he was a remarkable man who didn't take no for an answer. I mean, his imagination was incredible. And when you look at what he did with radio, it's just the beginning. I mean, this guy in theater, in film, in television, I mean, he was on the cutting edge. He was 70 years old when he died, and he was into video on a level that very few people at his age would even understand. But he would go into these demos with these engineers and absolutely exhaust them with questions and insight and that kind of thing. So he was a very, very smart man who knew how to take a new media and manipulate it beyond comprehension. And that's what he did with radio.
Wow. So inspiring. So incredibly inspiring. Well, Frank, thank you so much for sharing all this with us today. It really, I really appreciate it.
On choosing to do this show. I think you guys will have a good time. And I hope your radio season goes well, because it's a great, great thing you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. And I hope you're well amidst all this craziness that's going on. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.